You rush through each day fighting against the current, pushing harder only to find yourself more exhausted and further from peace. Every effort to control your circumstances creates more chaos, while others seem to move through life with effortless grace that feels impossible to achieve. I am Lao Tzu, and for over 2,500 years, seekers have found wisdom in the way that flows beneath all existence. What I discovered about Wu Wei, the art of effortless action, will transform how you approach every challenge, showing you how to achieve more by doing less. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see which corners of the world are ready to discover the gentle path. In my youth, I served as keeper of the royal archives in the Zhou court, surrounded by endless scrolls containing what my society considered the height of human wisdom. Day after day, I catalogued the accumulated knowledge of generations, strategies, administrative procedures, ceremonial protocols, and philosophical treatises that promised to solve every human problem through clever thinking and complex systems. Yet, as I immersed myself deeper into these ancient library scrolls, a troubling pattern emerged. The more sophisticated our solutions became, the more complicated our problems grew. The more we tried to control human nature through laws and regulations, the more rebellious people became. The harder we worked to create perfect order, the more chaos erupted around us. I watched brilliant ministers exhaust themselves, crafting elaborate policies that crumbled within months. I saw generals devise ingenious battle plans that failed, because they couldn't account for the unpredictable nature of actual warfare. I witnessed philosophers create beautiful logical systems that explained everything except why people remained unhappy despite following their teachings perfectly. The moment of my awakening came during a particularly frustrating day, when I was organizing treatises on governance. I had just finished reading a dense philosophical work about achieving social harmony through rigid hierarchy when I looked out the window and noticed something that changed my understanding forever. A small stream flowed past the palace grounds, and I watched as it encountered a massive boulder that completely blocked its path. Rather than fighting against this obstacle or trying to move it through force, the water simply flowed around it, finding the easiest route while continuing its journey toward the sea. Over time, I realized this gentle stream would wear away even the hardest stone, not through violence or struggle, but through patient persistence and natural action. In that moment, I understood that all our human efforts to force solutions were like trying to push the boulder upstream. We were fighting against the natural order instead of learning to work with it. The very scrolls I guarded represented humanity's attempt to improve upon nature's perfect design. But what if nature already knew best? This revelation led me to begin observing the natural world with new eyes. I watched how trees grew strongest when they bent with the wind, rather than resisting it. I noticed how birds achieved flight not by fighting gravity, but by understanding and cooperating with the invisible forces of air currents. I saw how animals lived in harmony with their environment without needing complex rules or sophisticated planning. The more I observed, the more I realized that there was an underlying intelligence operating in the universe, a natural way of being that required no effort yet accomplished everything necessary. This was my first glimpse of what I would later call the Tao, the source and pattern that underlies all existence. My colleagues thought I was becoming eccentric when I began spending more time in gardens than in the library. They worried when I started questioning whether our accumulated wisdom was actually making people wiser or just more confused. But I had discovered something that no amount of scholarly study could teach: the profound truth that the greatest accomplishments come through learning to align ourselves with natural forces rather than opposing them. Eventually, this understanding grew so strong that I could no longer remain in a position that required me to uphold systems built on force and artificial complexity. I made the difficult decision to leave my prestigious post and seek a simpler way of living, one that honored the natural intelligence I had glimpsed in that flowing stream. The Tao that can be spoken of is not the eternal Tao. These words, which would later open my most famous work, came to me during years of meditation and contemplation after leaving the royal court. I struggled for a long time to understand and describe what I had experienced, this underlying reality that seemed to be both everything and nothing simultaneously. Imagine trying to describe the taste of water to someone who has never experienced thirst, or explaining the concept of silence to someone who has never heard sound. This was my challenge in attempting to convey the nature of the Tao. How do you use words to point toward that which exists beyond all words and concepts? In my deepest meditations, often sitting beside that same stream that had first awakened me, I began to sense the Tao as the uncarved block of pure potential that exists before human intervention shapes it into specific forms. Like a piece of jade before the sculptor's tools touch it, the Tao contains infinite possibilities while remaining perfectly simple and whole. The Tao is the source from which all things emerge, yet it is not separate from those things. It is like the space within a room that makes the room useful, or the emptiness within a cup that allows it to hold water. Without this emptiness, neither the room nor the cup could fulfill their purpose. Yet we typically focus only on the solid walls and ignore the essential void they contain. I came to understand that the Tao manifests through what appears to be opposites, being and non-being, fullness and emptiness, action and stillness. But these are not truly opposites in conflict with each other. Rather, they are complementary aspects of one underlying reality, like two sides of the same coin that can never be separated. During one particularly profound meditation, I experienced a moment of direct contact with this source. All sense of myself as a separate individual dissolved, and I became aware of existing as part of a vast, intelligent flow that connected all things. In that timeless moment, I understood that the Tao is not something distant, that we must seek. It is the very ground of our being, the consciousness through which we are aware of ourselves and the world. This experience taught me that the Tao cannot be grasped by the thinking mind, because the thinking mind is itself a manifestation of the Tao. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The very instrument of perception cannot be directly perceived by itself. Yet just as we know our eyes exist because we can see, we can know the Tao exists because we can experience awareness itself. The Tao operates through natural spontaneity, not through forced effort. Watch how a flower blooms. There is no struggle or strain, no complicated planning or anxious effort. The flower simply follows its inherent nature, and this natural unfolding creates perfect beauty. This is how the Tao works in all things, including human beings. When we learn to stop interfering with our own natural wisdom, I realized that most human suffering comes from our attempts to improve upon the Tao's perfect design. We think we know better than the natural intelligence that created us, so we fight against our circumstances, resist the flow of life, and try to force outcomes according to our limited understanding. This is like a wave trying to fight against the ocean that gives it existence. The Tao is both empty and full, soft yet invincible, invisible yet more real than anything we can see or touch. It is the stillness within all movement, the silence within all sound, the peace within all activity. When we align ourselves with this underlying reality, we discover that we don't need to create peace or happiness. We simply need to stop disturbing. The peace and happiness that are our natural state, Wu Wei, which translates as non-action or effortless action, became the cornerstone of my teaching, though it remains one of the most misunderstood concepts I ever shared. People often mistake Wu Wei for laziness or passive inaction, but This could not be further from the truth. Wu Wei is actually the highest form of action that flows from deep understanding rather than forced effort. I discovered Wu Wei through observing a master swordsmith at work. This craftsman had spent decades perfecting his art, and when I watched him forge a blade, I witnessed something remarkable. His movements appeared effortless, almost like a dance, yet every strike of his hammer was precisely placed. The sword that emerged from his workshop was so perfectly balanced and sharp that it could cut through silk without resistance. When I asked him about his technique, he smiled and said, "I no longer make swords. The sword makes itself through me. I have learned to listen to the metal, to feel what it wants to become, and to help it achieve its natural perfection. When I was young, I fought against the material, trying to force it into the shape I wanted. Now I cooperate with its inherent nature, and the result is far superior to anything I could create through struggle." This master's sword became my symbol. For Wu Wei, a tool so perfectly crafted that it accomplishes its purpose without resistance, cutting through problems not through force, but through precise alignment with natural principles. I began applying this understanding to every aspect of my life. Instead of trying to convince people of my ideas through argument and persuasion, I learned to present truth in such a way that it became self-evident. Rather than forcing solutions to problems, I discovered how to create conditions where right action would emerge naturally. One of my most memorable experiences with Wu Wei came when I was asked to mediate a bitter dispute between two villagers over water rights. Both communities had prepared elaborate legal arguments and were ready for a prolonged battle. Instead of listening to their competing claims, I suggested we visit the disputed stream together. As we stood beside the flowing water, I asked a simple question: what does the stream want? This seemed like a foolish question at first, but as we observed the natural flow of the water, something shifted. The villagers began to see that the stream had its own wisdom about how to distribute its gifts. By working with the natural patterns of seasonal flow rather than against them, both communities could have abundant water without diminishing the other supply. The solution that emerged required no enforcement because it honored the inherent intelligence of the situation. This is the power of Wu, where when we align our actions with natural principles, we don't need to maintain our solutions through constant effort because they become self-sustaining. I taught rulers the same principle. The most effective government is that which governs least, not through neglect, but through creating conditions where people naturally choose beneficial actions. When laws align with human nature rather than fighting against it, order emerges spontaneously without the need for extensive enforcement. In modern terms, think of the entrepreneur who succeeds not by fighting market forces, but by recognizing emerging trends and positioning themselves to flow with them. They achieve extraordinary results, not through harder work, but through right timing and natural positioning. Their businesses grow organically because they're aligned with genuine needs and natural economic forces. Wu Wei doesn't mean being passive in the face of problems. When a tree's branch is weighted down by snow, Wu Wei is not leaving it to break, but gently shaking off the excess load so the branch can return to its natural position. Wu Wei is a responsive action that works with natural forces rather than against them. The practice of Wu Wei begins with developing sensitivity to the natural flow of situations. This requires cultivating inner stillness so we can perceive the subtle patterns and rhythms that guide all life. When we're driven by anxiety or ambition, we miss these gentle signals and end up forcing actions that create more problems than they solve. True Wu Wei emerges from deep trust in the intelligence of life itself. When we stop believing that we must control everything through personal effort, we discover that we're part of a larger intelligence that knows exactly how to orchestrate events for the highest good of all involved. Nothing in the world is softer than water, yet nothing is better at overcoming the hard and strong. This truth became central to my understanding of real power after years of observing how nature accomplishes the seemingly impossible through gentleness rather than force. I spent countless hours sitting in valleys, those low places that receive all things and nourish life through their receptive nature. A valley doesn't compete with mountains for attention or try to tower above other features of the landscape. Instead, it creates the conditions where rivers flow, where fertile soil gathers, where communities flourish. The valley's power lies precisely in its willingness to be low and receptive. One day, while contemplating the nature of strength, I witnessed a powerful demonstration of softness overcoming hardness. A fierce windstorm struck the mountain where I was staying, and I watched as mighty oak tree symbols of strength and endurance were uprooted and broken by the gale. Yet the flexible bamboo, which bent completely to the ground under the wind's force, sprang back unharmed when the storm passed. This taught me that true strength is not rigid resistance, but flexible resilience. The bamboo survived, not despite its softness, but because of it. By yielding to the superior force, it avoided destruction and maintained its essential integrity. I began to notice this principle everywhere in human relationships. The parent who rules through love and patience shapes their children far more profoundly than one who relies on stern authority. The gentle mother's influence often determines the destiny of nations, not through force, but through the subtle power of nurturing and guidance that reaches into the deepest parts of the human heart. I observed how the tongue, soft and yielding, outlasts the teeth, despite their hardness. The teeth, for all their apparent strength, eventually wear down and fall out, while the flexible tongue remains healthy throughout a person's entire life. This became one of my favorite examples of how softness contains a power that hardness lacks. In my interactions with political leaders, I discovered that those who governed through harsh measures inevitably created rebellion and resistance. The more force they applied, the more force was generated against them. But leaders who governed through moral example and gentle guidance found that people naturally wanted to follow them. Their soft power was far more effective than any army. I learned to apply this principle in my own life through the practice of yielding. When someone approached me with anger or hostility, instead of meeting their hardness with equal hardness, I would respond with soft receptivity. This didn't mean becoming weak or passive. It meant becoming like water that absorbs the impact of a stone thrown into it. The water isn't damaged by the stone. Instead, it surrounds and eventually polishes the rough edges. This approach often had remarkable results. People who came to argue would find themselves softening in the face of genuine receptivity. Their anger would dissipate because it had nothing solid to strike against. Often, they would leave our encounters feeling heard and understood rather than defeated, which created the possibility for real resolution rather than temporary victory. The power of softness extends to how we approach our own internal struggles as well. When we fight against our unwanted thoughts and emotions, we often strengthen them through resistance. But when we learn to receive our experience with gentle acceptance, like a mother holding a distressed child, we create space for natural healing and transformation. I discovered that softness is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Strength that doesn't need to prove itself through domination. Water doesn't need to announce its power. It simply flows around obstacles and eventually wears away mountains. The wise person cultivates this same quality, becoming like water that nourishes all life without competing, that flows toward the lowest places that others disdain, that accomplishes great things without claiming credit, in a world that often mistakes aggression for strength and loudness for authority. The power of softness remains one of the most misunderstood yet essential teachings. Those who master this principle discovered that they can accomplish far more through gentle persistence than through all the force and struggle that others employ in their futile attempts to dominate life rather than dance with it. Return to the uncarved block. This became one of my most cherished teachings, born from the recognition that our original nature contains a wisdom and completeness that no amount of learning or sophistication can improve upon. The uncarved block, which I called Pooh, represents the state of natural simplicity before human cleverness begins reshaping it according to limited understanding. I came to this realization through a profound experience with a master potter whose work I had long admired. When I asked him about his extraordinary skill, he showed me two vessels. One was elaborately decorated with intricate patterns and glazed in brilliant colors, while the other was a simple clay pot with no ornamentation whatsoever. "Which one is more beautiful?" he asked. I naturally pointed to the decorated piece, thinking this was what he wanted to hear. But he smiled and said, "Look more carefully. The decorated pot shows my skill and knowledge, but it also shows my ego and desire to impress. The simple pot shows the natural beauty of the clay itself, undisturbed by my need to prove anything. Which one better serves its purpose of holding water?" As I contemplated his words, I realized that the clay pot was useful precisely because of its emptiness. The space within that had been left alone rather than filled with decoration. This emptiness was not a lack, but the very source of the pot's function. Without this preserved simplicity, all the elaborate decoration in the world could not make it serve its essential purpose. This insight revolutionized my understanding of human development. I began to see that much of what we call education and sophistication actually moves us further from wisdom rather than closer to it. We accumulate knowledge, develop complex theories, and create elaborate systems of thought, but in doing so, we often lose touch with the simple, direct perception that children possess naturally. I remember watching a child play by the same stream where I had my first awakening. The child was completely absorbed in the movement of the water, laughing with pure delight at the dancing patterns of light on the surface. There was no analysis, no attempt to understand or explain, just direct, joyful participation in the beauty of the moment. In that child's simple presence, I recognized a wisdom that all my years of scholarship had not provided. This led me to question whether complexity truly serves us or simply satisfies our intellectual pride. I observed how the most profound truths are usually the simplest ones, while complicated explanations often mask confusion rather than revealing clarity. The fundamental principles that govern life, love, kindness, honesty, courage, require no sophisticated understanding to practice, yet they contain infinite depth for those who live them authentically. I began deliberately simplifying my own life, letting go of possessions that served no real purpose, abandoning practices that were performed more for appearance than genuine benefit, and releasing ideas that made me feel clever but didn't contribute to actual wisdom. This process of subtraction rather than addition brought a peace and clarity I had never experienced through accumulation. The simplicity I'm describing is not ignorance or primitive thinking. It's the kind of sophistication that has gone full circle and returned to naturalness. Like a master musician who has practiced so extensively that technique becomes invisible, allowing pure music to flow through them. The wise person has integrated all learning until it dissolves into effortless presence. I discovered that simplicity creates space for genuine spontaneity and creativity. When our minds are cluttered with complicated theories and strategies, we lose the ability to respond freshly to each moment. But when we return to the uncarved block of our original nature, we regain access to the natural intelligence that knows exactly what to do in every situation without having to think about it. This doesn't mean abandoning learning or becoming anti-intellectual. Rather, it means holding all knowledge lightly, using it when helpful but not being enslaved by it. It means remembering that the purpose of all teaching is to return us to our own natural wisdom, not to replace that wisdom with external authority. The path of simplicity requires great courage because it means letting go of the complicated identities we've constructed for ourselves. But in this letting go, we discover the profound peace that comes from wanting less rather than having more, from being content with what is rather than constantly seeking what might be. The best leaders are those whose existence the people are barely aware of. This principle emerged from my observations of true authority versus the counterfeit power that dominates through force and demands constant recognition. Real leadership, I discovered, flows like a hidden spring that nourishes an entire forest without announcing its presence. During my years at court, I witnessed many different styles of rule. Some emperors governed through fear and spectacle, constantly reminding their subjects of their power through elaborate ceremonies and harsh punishments. Others tried to win popularity through lavish gifts and entertainment. But the most effective rulers I observed were those who seemed to govern almost invisibly, creating conditions where good order emerged naturally without apparent effort on their part. I remember one provincial governor who embodied this principle perfectly. When I first visited his territory, I was struck by the prosperity and peace that prevailed everywhere. The markets flourished, disputes were rare, and people seemed genuinely content with their lives. Yet, when I asked residents about their governor, many could hardly describe him beyond noting that he was a good man who didn't interfere with things unnecessarily. When I finally met this governor, I understood why his leadership was so effective. He spent most of his time listening rather than speaking, observing the natural rhythms of his community rather than imposing artificial changes. When problems arose, he would ask questions that helped people discover their own solutions, rather than dictating answers from his position of authority. I have learned, he told me, that my job is not to control everything, but to create conditions where people can govern themselves wisely. When the harvest is good, people say it was due to favorable weather. When trade prospers, they credit their own hard work. When conflicts are resolved peacefully, they feel proud of their community's wisdom. They don't think about me at all, and that's exactly as it should be. This approach required tremendous humility and trust in the natural wisdom of the people he served. Lesser leaders feel threatened when they don't receive credit for every success. But this governor understood that true leadership means serving the greater good rather than feeding personal ego. I began to see the same principle at work in families. The most effective parents are often those who guide through example rather than constant instruction. They create an environment where children naturally develop good character rather than trying to force virtue through endless rules and punishments. Years later, these children may not even realize how skillfully they were guided. They simply remember feeling loved and supported as they grew into their own wisdom. This paradox of leadership extends to any situation where one person seeks to influence others. The teacher who truly educates helps students discover their own intelligence rather than filling them with information. The coach who develops champions creates conditions where athletes can access their natural abilities rather than trying to control every movement. The manager who builds effective teams empowers others to excel rather than micromanaging every decision. I learned to apply this principle in my own interactions with those who sought my guidance. Instead of presenting myself as an authority with all the answers, I would ask questions that helped people find their own understanding. Rather than solving their problems for them, I would point toward principles that allowed them to develop their own solutions. This approach often required great patience and restraint. There were many times when I could see exactly what someone needed to do, and it would have been much faster to simply tell them. But I had learned that wisdom gained through personal discovery is far more valuable than advice received from external authority. No matter how correct that advice might be, The hidden spring that nourishes the forest never demands recognition for its service. It simply provides what is needed when it is needed, allowing life to flourish naturally. This became my model for all forms of leadership, to serve the growth and well-being of others, while remaining humble about my role in their success. True leaders understand that their greatest achievement is developing other leaders who will surpass them. They measure their success not by how much power they accumulate, but by how much wisdom and capability they help others discover within themselves. They lead from behind, as I often said, supporting others in finding their own way forward rather than demanding that everyone follow their particular path. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. When people see some things as good, other things become bad. This fundamental insight into the nature of opposites became one of my most important teachings, symbolized by what would later be known as the yin-yang, the dynamic dance of complementary forces that creates all life and movement in the universe. My understanding of this principle deepened during long nights of meditation, when I would observe the interplay between darkness and light. I realized that without darkness, we could never appreciate light, and without light, darkness would have no meaning. They don't oppose each other, they define and create each other in an eternal dance of mutual dependence. I began to see this pattern everywhere. Joy becomes meaningful only in contrast to sorrow. Strength is recognized only in relation to weakness. Success gains significance only when failure is possible. Rather than trying to eliminate one side of these pairs, I learned that wisdom lies in understanding their essential unity and learning to dance with both aspects. One of my most profound experiences with this truth came during a conversation with a successful merchant who was tormented by fear of losing his wealth. He had worked tirelessly to accumulate riches, thinking that financial security would bring him peace. Instead, he found that the more he gained, the more he had to lose, and his anxiety grew proportionally with his success. "You are fighting against the natural rhythm of life," I told him. "Wealth and poverty, gain and loss, expansion and contraction, these are not enemies to be defeated, but partners in the dance of existence. When you try to have only gain without loss, only expansion without contraction, you create internal warfare that brings suffering regardless of your external circumstances." I encouraged him to observe how nature embraces both aspects of every cycle. Trees don't resist the autumn shedding of leaves in order to cling to the appearance of summer fullness. They surrender what is no longer needed, trusting that spring will bring new growth. The seasons teach us that apparent loss is often preparation for greater abundance, but only if we cooperate with the natural rhythm rather than fighting against it does. This principle applies equally to masculine and feminine energies within each person. Every human being contains both the yang force of active assertion and the yin force of receptive wisdom. Problems arise when we try to develop only one aspect while suppressing the other. The most effective leaders combine decisive action with deep listening. The most fulfilled individuals integrate both giving and receiving, both strength and tenderness. I observed how conflict often arises from the illusion that we must choose between opposites rather than learning to embody both appropriately. Nations go to war because they see strength and peace as incompatible, not realizing that true peace often requires the strength to defend what is valuable, while lasting strength is built on the foundation of peaceful cooperation. In my own life, I learned to embrace the interplay between solitude and community, action and stillness, teaching and learning. Instead of seeing these as contradictory choices, I discovered how each aspect enhanced and enriched the other. My periods of solitary meditation deepened my ability to serve others wisely. My interactions with students clarified my own understanding. My moments of active engagement gave meaning to my times of rest. The practical application of this teaching requires developing what I call both and thinking instead of either or thinking. When facing difficult decisions, instead of asking, should I choose option A or option B, the wise person asks, how can I honor the truth contained in both options? This approach often reveals creative solutions that transcend the apparent conflict. I taught people to look for the seed of its opposite within every experience. Within every challenge lies the potential for growth. Within every success lies the seed of complacency that could lead to failure. Within every ending lies the beginning of something new. When we learn to perceive these hidden connections, we stop being thrown off balance by the inevitable changes of life. The yin-yang symbol that represents this teaching shows each force containing a dot of its opposite, reminding us that absolute purity of either force is impossible and undesirable. Perfect balance is not a static state, but a dynamic equilibrium. Like a dancer who maintains balance through constant, subtle adjustments rather than rigid stillness. This understanding brings tremendous freedom because it releases us from the exhausting attempt to create a life of pure positivity without any challenges or difficulties. Instead, we learn to find the hidden gifts within every experience and to see apparent opposites as dance partners rather than enemies. Fill your bowl to the brim and it will spill. Keep sharpening your knife and it will blunt. This truth about the importance of knowing when enough is enough came to me through observing the destruction that inevitably follows excessive accumulation, whether of wealth, power, knowledge, or even virtue. I learned this lesson most powerfully through the story of a merchant I knew who had built a prosperous trading business through years of honest work and careful planning. His success was well-deserved, and for many years he provided valuable services to his community while maintaining a comfortable life for his family. But success became like wine to him. The more he tasted, the more he craved. Instead of being content with sufficient prosperity, he began pursuing wealth for its own sake. He expanded into ventures he didn't understand, made increasingly risky investments, and eventually compromised the ethical standards that had originally earned him respect. His full cup, which had provided nourishment for so long, finally overflowed and was lost entirely. In trying to have everything, he lost what he had already gained. This merchant's downfall illustrated a principle I had observed repeatedly. There is a natural peak to all things, and wisdom lies in recognizing when that peak has been reached. Like a tree that breaks under the weight of too much fruit, or a string that snaps when tuned too tightly, excessive pursuit of even good things leads to destruction. Speyer began to understand that knowing when to stop is perhaps the most difficult skill to master, because it requires us to act against our instinctive drive for more. In nature, animals eat until satisfied and then rest. But humans have developed the peculiar ability to want more even when we have enough, leading us to push beyond natural limits into the territory of diminishing returns and eventual collapse. This principle applies to every area of life. The athlete who trains beyond their body's capacity for recovery will eventually suffer injury that ends their career. The student who studies without rest will find their mind becoming dull rather than sharp. The parent who tries to control every aspect of their child's life will damage the relationship they're trying to protect. I witnessed this pattern in my own intellectual development. There was a period when I pursued knowledge with such intensity that I read everything I could find, memorized vast amounts of information, and engaged in constant philosophical debate. But eventually I realized that this accumulation of concepts was actually moving me away from understanding rather than toward it. The cup of my mind had become so full that there was no room for genuine insight to enter. This realization led me to begin the practice of intellectual fasting periods, when I would stop reading and thinking, and simply allow my mind to rest in not knowing. To my surprise, these empty spaces often yielded more profound understanding than all my previous study. I learned that wisdom often requires unlearning as much as learning, creating space for fresh perception by releasing attachment to accumulated knowledge. The same principle governs emotional and spiritual development. I have seen people who pursued enlightenment with such aggressive intensity that they became spiritually proud and rigid, defeating the very purpose of their seeking. The cup of their spiritual achievement became so full that it left no room for the humility and openness that authentic awakening requires. Even in governance, I observed how rulers who pushed their authority too far inevitably created the conditions for their own downfall. The most sustainable power comes from knowing how much influence to exert and when to step back, allowing natural order to maintain itself without constant intervention. Learning when to stop requires developing sensitivity to natural rhythms and cycles. Every expansion is naturally followed by contraction, every period of growth by a time of consolidation. Fighting against these rhythms leads to exhaustion and eventual collapse, while cooperating with them creates sustainable success. I taught people to pay attention to the subtle signs that indicate when enough has become too much, when success starts feeling burdensome rather than joyful, when accumulation creates anxiety rather than security, when pushing harder produces diminishing results rather than greater achievement. The wisdom of the full cup teaches us that preservation often requires restraint. By stopping before the breaking point, we maintain what we have built. By knowing when we have enough, we can actually enjoy what we possess, rather than being driven by endless craving for more. This is not laziness or lack of ambition, it is the highest form of intelligence, the ability to recognize and honor natural limits that ensure long-term flourishing rather than short-term excess, followed by inevitable collapse. In stillness and quiet, all things can be accomplished. This understanding came to me gradually as I learned to distinguish between the constant chatter of the thinking mind and the deeper intelligence that operates in silence. Like a still pool that perfectly reflects the sky, the quiet mind becomes a mirror for truth that the agitated mind cannot perceive. My practice of meditation began during those early years when I would sit beside the stream near the palace grounds. Initially, I was simply seeking respite from the mental exhaustion that came from trying to solve complex problems through endless thinking. But what started as an escape gradually became the most profound education of my life. In the beginning, sitting quietly was anything but peaceful. My mind raced with thoughts about my responsibilities, replayed conversations from the day, and generated endless plans for the future. I felt like I was trying to calm a hurricane with whispered words, but I persisted, not because I was making progress, but because something deep within me recognized that this practice was essential. Gradually, I began to notice spaces between thoughts, brief moments of silence that occurred naturally when one mental activity ended before another began. These gaps were like glimpses of vast sky between racing clouds. At first they lasted only an instant, but as I learned to rest attention in these natural pauses, they began to expand. The breakthrough came during a meditation when I realized I was not my thoughts, but the awareness in which thoughts appeared. This was like discovering that I was not the waves on the ocean's surface, but the ocean itself, vast, deep, and fundamentally undisturbed by the surface activity. The constant mental commentary that I had taken to be myself was revealed as just one small aspect of consciousness, not its essential nature. In this still space, I found access to a form of knowing that didn't depend on thinking. Solutions to problems would arise spontaneously, not through logical analysis, but through direct insight. I would sit with a question and simply wait in receptive silence until understanding emerged, often in ways that surprised my logical mind with their elegant simplicity. I discovered that this inner stillness was not empty nothingness, but full presence, a pregnant silence that contained infinite potential. It was like the silence between musical notes that gives music its rhythm and meaning. or the pause between breaths that allows breathing to flow naturally. This practice transformed my relationship with challenges and decisions. Instead of immediately jumping into mental problem-solving mode, I learned to first become still and listen for the subtle guidance that was always available beneath the surface noise of anxiety and confusion. Often, what seemed like complex problems would resolve themselves when approached from this deeper awareness. The stillness I cultivated began to influence all my activities. Even in the midst of busy days, I could access this inner quiet and act from a place of centered presence, rather than reactive agitation. Conversations became more meaningful because I was truly listening rather than preparing my next response. Work became more efficient because I was acting from clarity rather than confused effort. I taught others this practice by first helping them understand the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge accumulates information and concepts, but wisdom emerges from the silent awareness that knows without thinking. A mother knows how to care for her child not through studying parenting manuals, but through the intuitive understanding that arises from loving presence. The still pool became my symbol for the properly prepared mindclear.com and perfectly reflective. When the mind is agitated by desires, fears, and constant mental activity, it's like a pond stirred by wind, unable to reflect anything clearly. But when we learn to cultivate inner stillness, the mind becomes a perfect mirror that can perceive truth directly without the distortion of preconceptions and prejudices. This stillness is not something we create through effort, but something we uncover by stopping the activities that disturb our natural peace. Like removing the sediment from muddy water by letting it settle, we discover mental clarity not by adding something new, but by ceasing to stir up confusion through excessive thinking and emotional reactivity. The practical fruits of this practice are immediate and profound. Decisions become easier because we can feel the rightness or wrongness of choices before committing to them. Relationships improve because we respond from centered awareness rather than unconscious patterns. Creativity flows more freely because we're not blocking inspiration with mental interference. A good person is the bad person's teacher. A bad person is the good person's lesson. This principle emerged from my deep conviction that violence, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, only creates more violence in an endless cycle of retaliation and suffering. True strength, I discovered, lies in the ability to respond to aggression with compassion, transforming enemies into allies through the gentle rain of understanding. My commitment to nonviolence was tested severely during a period when bandits were terrorizing the region where I lived. These men had been driven to desperation by years of warfare and famine, and they saw violence as their only means of survival. Many villagers demanded that the authorities respond with overwhelming force to crush this threat, but I suggested a different approach. I asked to meet with the leader of these bandits, a request that many considered either foolish or suicidal. When we finally encountered each other in a remote mountain clearing, I saw not a monster, but a man whose eyes held the pain of countless losses and betrayals. Instead of lecturing him about morality or threatening him with consequences, I simply listened to his story. This hardened criminal told me about watching his family starve during a harsh winter, while wealthy nobles hoarded grain in their storehouses. He described being forced from his ancestral land by corrupt officials and seeing his children die from diseases that could have been prevented with basic medical care. His violence, I realized, was not born from evil but from a broken heart that had learned to protect itself through aggression. As our conversation continued, something remarkable happened. The gentle rain of genuine attention and compassion began to soften the hardened ground of his resentment. He had been prepared for judgment, rejection, or combat, but he had no defense against authentic care for his suffering. When someone finally saw his pain rather than just his actions, the warrior facade began to crack. revealing the wounded human being underneath. I didn't try to convince him that his methods were wrong. He already knew that on some level. Instead, I helped him remember who he had been before life forced him into the role of an outlaw. We spoke about his original dreams, his love for his lost family, and his deep longing for a life of dignity and purpose. By the end of our meeting, he was ready to consider alternatives to the path of violence that had brought him nothing but more suffering. This encounter taught me that people rarely choose evil for its own sake. Most harmful behavior stems from unhealed wounds, unmet needs, or desperation born from feeling trapped with no alternatives. When we respond to such behavior with more violence, we simply confirm the person's belief that the world is a hostile place where only the strong survive. But when we respond with compassionate understanding, we create the possibility for transformation. I learned to apply this principle in smaller, daily interactions as well. When someone spoke to me with anger or disrespect, instead of defending myself or counterattacking, I would try to sense the pain or fear underneath their aggressive words. Often, this shift in perception would allow me to respond in a way that addressed their actual need rather than just reacting to their behavior. This doesn't mean becoming passive or allowing others to harm us or those we're responsible to protect. True nonviolence sometimes requires firm boundaries and decisive action, but it means choosing responses that seek to heal the root causes of violence rather than simply suppressing its symptoms through superior force. The gentle rain that nourishes all life without discrimination became my symbol for this approach. Rain doesn't judge which plants deserve water and which don't. It simply provides what is needed for life to flourish. Similarly, compassion doesn't evaluate whether someone deserves understanding before offering it. It recognizes that all beings suffer and that suffering, unhealed, inevitably creates more suffering. I witnessed how this principle could transform entire communities. When leaders responded to social problems with punitive measures alone, the underlying issues would simply manifest in new forms. But when they addressed the roots of discontent, poverty, injustice, lack of opportunity with genuine care and practical solutions, lasting peace would naturally emerge. The art of nonviolence requires tremendous courage because it means remaining open-hearted in the face of hostility. It's much easier to close our hearts and respond with matching aggression than to maintain compassion when confronted with hatred. But this courage is rewarded with the profound satisfaction of helping to break cycles of violence rather than perpetuating them. The sage is guided by what he feels and not by what he sees. This teaching about detachment from outcomes emerged from my recognition that our attachment to specific results often prevents us from achieving our deeper purposes. Like a farmer who plants seeds with care but must release them to grow according to natural law, we must learn to act with full commitment while holding our desired outcomes lightly. My understanding of this principle deepened through observing an elderly farmer whose wisdom had been earned through decades of working with the unpredictable forces of nature. Each spring, he would prepare his fields with meticulous attention, plant his crops with expert care, and tend them throughout the growing season with devoted effort. But he never spent his days anxiously worrying about the harvest or trying to force the plants to grow faster than their natural rhythm allowed. "I do everything within my power to create the conditions for a good harvest," he told me. "But ultimately, the outcome depends on forces beyond my control: the weather, the soil, the natural cycles of growth and rest. If I spend my energy worrying about results I cannot guarantee, I rob myself of the joy of participating in the miracle of cultivation. And I often make poor decisions based on fear rather than wisdom." This farmer's approach embodied what I came to call acting without attachment, giving our complete attention and effort to the process, while releasing our grip on the specific outcomes we prefer. The seed he plants represents our actions, which we offer with care and intention. then trust to unfold according to the deeper intelligence that governs all growth. I learned to apply this principle in my own teaching and writing. When people sought my guidance, I would share what seemed most helpful based on their situation and my understanding, but I couldn't control whether they would accept or apply what I offered. If I attached my sense of success to their immediate response, I would either become discouraged when they resisted or proud when they praised my wisdom, both reactions that would distort my ability to serve them authentically. The deeper wisdom behind detachment is that outcomes are rarely entirely within our control, but our approach and effort always are. When we focus primarily on results, we often become anxious and manipulative, trying to force situations to conform to our desires. But when we focus on bringing our best effort and intention to each moment, we remain centered and effective regardless of external circumstances. This principle proved especially valuable in my interactions with political leaders. Many rulers I advised were driven by attachment to their legacy, constantly worrying about how history would judge their decisions. This anxiety often led them to make choices based on appearance rather than substance, seeking short-term popularity rather than long-term benefit for their people. I taught them to focus on acting from their deepest understanding of what would serve the greater good, then releasing attachment to whether their efforts would be recognized or appreciated. This shift often freed them to make courageous decisions that they had previously avoided out of fear of criticism or failure. The practice of detachment doesn't mean becoming passive or indifferent. The farmer, I observed, was deeply committed to his work. He simply wasn't enslaved by anxiety about factors beyond his influence. True detachment is actually the foundation of more effective action because it allows us to respond to situations as they are rather than as we wish they were. I discovered that attachment to outcomes often stems from the ego's need to feel in control and to take credit for success. When we can act from genuine care for the well-being of others rather than from personal ambition, detachment becomes natural. We do what needs to be done because it needs to be done, not because we expect specific rewards or recognition. This principle extends to our relationship with our own personal development. Many people become frustrated with spiritual practice because they're attached to achieving particular states of consciousness or levels of wisdom. But growth unfolds according to its own timeline and rhythm, often in ways that surprise our expectations. When we can engage in practice for its own sake rather than as a strategy to achieve predetermined goals, we create the relaxed awareness in which genuine transformation can occur. The artist who creates masterpieces exemplifies this teaching perfectly. They become so absorbed in the creative process itself that self-consciousness disappears, and the work flows through them without interference from concerns about commercial success or critical approval. The resulting art carries a quality of authenticity and aliveness that calculated efforts rarely achieve. Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? This question encapsulates my understanding that most human suffering comes from our attempts to control what cannot be controlled, rather than learning to influence through harmony with natural forces. The kite string became my favorite metaphor for this teaching, showing how apparent control actually requires yielding to the very forces we think we're mastering. I learnt this lesson through my own painful struggle with trying to control the outcomes of my teaching. In my early years as a sage, I was deeply attached to having my students understand my words exactly as I intended them. I would become frustrated when they misinterpreted my meaning or applied my teachings in ways that seemed to miss the point entirely. I felt responsible for their progress and took their failures as evidence of my inadequacy as a teacher. This attachment to controlling their learning process was exhausting and ultimately counterproductive. The more I tried to force understanding, the more resistance I encountered. Students would become defensive when I corrected them too forcefully, or they would become dependent on my approval rather than developing their own inner authority. The breakthrough came when I observed a master flying kites with children during a festival. I watched as he held the string just firmly enough to maintain connection with his kite, but not so tightly that he prevented it from dancing with the wind. When strong gusts threatened to tear the kite away, he didn't fight against the wind's power. Instead, he gave more string, allowing the kite to ride the current until it found stability again. The kite wants to fly, he explained to the fascinated children. My job is not to make it fly, but to help it find the wind. If I hold too tightly, I'll either break the string or keep the kite from soaring. If I hold too loosely, I'll lose connection altogether. The art is in feeling the balance between connection and freedom. This image revolutionized my understanding of influence versus control. I realized that I had been trying to make my students fly according to my vision, rather than helping them discover their own natural capacity for wisdom. True teaching, like kite flying, requires sensitive responsiveness rather than rigid direction. I began experimenting with this lighter touch in all my relationships. Instead of trying to convince people of my perspectives through argument and persistence, I learned to offer my understanding and then trust their intelligence to recognize what was useful for them. Instead of pushing against resistance, I would look for natural openings where influence could flow freely. This approach proved far more effective than my previous efforts to control outcomes. When people felt free to reject my ideas without losing my respect, they paradoxically became more open to considering them. When I stopped trying to change them and simply offered my authentic presence, they often found their own motivation for growth. The practice of releasing control requires developing trust in the fundamental intelligence of life itself. We must learn to believe that there are larger forces at work than our individual will, and that these forces are ultimately benevolent and wise. This doesn't mean becoming passive, but rather learning to cooperate with the natural flow of events rather than constantly swimming against the current. I discovered that what we typically call control is usually just a sophisticated form of worry and manipulation. We try to manage every variable in our environment because we're afraid that if we don't maintain constant vigilance, everything will fall apart. But this exhausting effort often prevents us from noticing the natural order that would emerge if we stepped back and allowed it space to manifest. The mud settling in clear water became another powerful image for this teaching. When we're upset or confused, our natural impulse is to do something immediately to fix the situation. But often the wisest action is to wait patiently while the emotional sediment settles, allowing clarity to emerge naturally, rather than stirring up more confusion through premature action. This principle applies to conflict resolution, decision-making, and personal healing. The parent who can remain centered during their child's emotional storm often finds that the child naturally returns to balance without need for intervention. The manager who can sit with uncertainty during a crisis often discovers solutions that wouldn't have been visible through forced problem solving. Learning to influence rather than control requires developing what I call responsive spontaneity, ability to remain alert and ready to act while simultaneously relaxed about outcomes. Like a master martial artist who can respond instantly to an opponent's movements without being tense or aggressive. We learn to engage fully with life while holding our preferences lightly. The ultimate freedom comes when we realize that the only thing we can truly control is our own response to whatever circumstances arise. When we stop exhausting ourselves trying to manage the unmanageable and instead focus on cultivating wisdom, compassion, and skillful action, we discover a form of influence that is far more powerful than control. The influence that comes from embodying the very qualities we wish to see in the world. Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished. This profound truth came to me through years of observing the patient rhythms that govern all life, from the slow growth of the ancient tree that endures for centuries to the gentle persistence of seasons that never rush, yet never fail to arrive at their appointed time. My teacher in this wisdom was an enormous oak tree that grew near my meditation spot. When I first began sitting in its shade, I was still caught in the human obsession with speed and efficiency. I would become impatient during meditation, frustrated when insights didn't come quickly, anxious about how long my spiritual development was taking compared to other seekers I had heard about. But this ancient tree, which had witnessed hundreds of seasons and countless human generations, emanated a different quality of time entirely. There was no urgency in its being, no sense that it was behind schedule or needed to accomplish anything beyond what was naturally unfolding. Yet season after season, it produced perfect leaves, provided shelter for countless creatures, and deepened its roots into the earth with inexorable patience. I began to study this tree's approach to growth. In spring, it didn't strain to produce leaves faster than its natural rhythm allowed. In autumn, it released its foliage without clinging or premature shedding. In winter, it rested completely, using this dormant period to gather energy for the next cycle of expansion. The tree taught me that there is a time for every activity, and wisdom lies in aligning ourselves with these natural cycles rather than fighting against them. This understanding transformed my approach to every aspect of life. I learned to recognize the seasons within my own development, times for learning and expansion, times for applying what I had learned, times for rest and integration, and times for releasing what was no longer serving me. When I tried to force growth during natural resting periods, I became exhausted and unproductive. When I tried to hold on to phases that had completed their purpose, I prevented new development from emerging. I applied this principle to my teaching as well. Instead of trying to cram as much information as possible into each interaction with students, I learned to plant seeds of understanding and trust the natural timing of their unfoldment. Some insights could be grasped immediately, while others needed to germinate in the darkness of not knowing before emerging into conscious understanding. One of my students exemplified the wisdom of natural timing perfectly. He was a successful merchant who came to me feeling frustrated about his spiritual progress. He had been practicing meditation and studying philosophy for several years, but felt that he wasn't advancing as quickly as he should. He compared himself to others who seemed to have dramatic breakthroughs, while his own development felt incremental and unremarkable. I took him to visit my teacher tree and asked him to observe its growth process. "How fast does this oak grow?" I asked. He replied that it must grow very slowly, since it was so ancient and massive. And yet, I pointed out, it has achieved something that no amount of hurried growth could accomplish: the kind of deep strength that can weather any storm and provide shelter for generations. This student gradually learned to appreciate the value of slow, steady development over dramatic but unsustainable breakthroughs. His practice deepened as he released the pressure to achieve quick results and instead focused on consistent daily cultivation. Years later, he had developed the kind of centered presence and practical wisdom that comes only through patient integration of understanding with lived experience. The ancient tree also taught me about the importance of deep roots. In our hurried culture, we often focus on visible growth, the leaves and branches of achievement, while neglecting the invisible foundation that makes sustainable success possible. But the tree spends as much energy developing its root system as its visible structure. Understanding that surface beauty without deep grounding leads to eventual collapse, I've learned to apply this principle by ensuring that each stage of my development was thoroughly integrated before moving on to the next. This sometimes meant spending months or even years working with a single insight until it became embodied wisdom rather than mere intellectual understanding. The patience this required was challenging for my ambitious ego, but the resulting stability was invaluable. Natural timing also taught me about the wisdom of waiting for the right moment to act. The tree doesn't force its buds to open before spring arrives, no matter how eager it might be to grow. Similarly, I learned to sense when conditions were ripe for various endeavors, and when patient waiting would serve better than premature action. This doesn't mean becoming passive or using natural timing as an excuse for procrastination. The tree is always actively growing, even when that growth is invisible. The entrepreneur who understands natural timing prepares thoroughly during quiet periods, so they can respond quickly when opportunities arise. The artist cultivates their skills during uninspired phases so they can fully express their vision when creativity flows. Living in natural time requires developing sensitivity to the subtle rhythms and cycles that govern all life. This means learning to feel when our energy is naturally high or low, when relationships are ready for deeper intimacy or need space to breathe, when projects are ready to be launched or need more incubation time. I have 3 treasures that I hold and keep safe: compassion, frugality, and humility. These 3 virtues, which I came to consider the most essential teachings of my entire philosophy, were crystallized for me through a profound experience that literally saved my life and transformed my understanding of true power. The jade pendant that would become my symbol for these treasures was given to me by an old woman during a time when I was traveling through a region devastated by war and famine. I had been robbed by desperate bandits and left with nothing but the clothes on my back, wandering in the wilderness for days without food or shelter. Weak and discouraged, I encountered this elderly woman who was herself clearly struggling to survive, despite her own poverty. She invited me to share the meager meal she had prepared from wild roots and herbs. As we sat together around her small fire, she told me stories of how she had maintained hope and kindness throughout decades of hardship. When I rose to continue my journey, she pressed the jade pendant into my hands, her only possession of value. These 3 sides represent the only treasures that truly matter, she explained, pointing to the triangular stone. Compassion gives us the courage to open our hearts even when the world seems cruel. Frugality teaches us that happiness comes from appreciating what we have rather than acquiring what we lack. Humility reminds us that our greatest strength lies in recognizing how much we don't know. Her generosity, in the midst of her own need, embodied all 3 virtues perfectly. She had shown compassion by caring for a stranger, frugality by finding contentment with almost nothing, and humility by offering her wisdom without claiming any special authority. In that moment, I understood that these qualities represented a form of wealth that could never be stolen or lost. Compassion, the first treasure, is not mere sentiment or pity, but the recognition of our fundamental interconnection with all life. When we truly understand that another person's suffering diminishes us and their happiness enhances us, compassion becomes as natural as caring for our own well-being. This woman's compassion toward me was actually an expression of enlightened self-interest. She understood that in a world where we are all connected, helping others is the most practical way to help ourselves. I learned that true compassion requires tremendous courage because it means remaining open-hearted in a world that often rewards cynicism and self-protection. It's much easier to close our hearts and focus only on our own concerns than to feel the pain and joy of others as if they were our own. But when we choose compassion, despite its difficulties, we discover that it becomes a source of energy rather than drain, connecting us to the infinite wellspring of love that underlies all existence. Frugality, the second treasure, is the art of finding abundance through simplicity rather than accumulation. This virtue goes far beyond mere financial economy to encompass a way of being that appreciates the richness already present in each moment. The old woman who shared her simple meal with me was wealthier in that moment than many nobles I had known who possessed vast material riches but remained perpetually dissatisfied. True frugality is generous because it recognizes that enough is plenty, leaving surplus to be shared with others. When we're not driven by endless desires for more, we have both the resources and the mental space to notice and respond to others' needs. Frugality teaches us to distinguish between our genuine needs and the artificial wants created by comparing ourselves to others or believing advertising messages about what should make us happy. Humility, the third treasure, is perhaps the most paradoxical virtue because it represents the ultimate strength that comes from admitting our limitations. The humility I learned from this wise woman was not self-deprecation or false modesty, but accurate self-knowledge that freed her from the exhausting burden of pretending to be more than she was. True humility recognizes that our individual knowledge and abilities, however developed, are tiny in comparison to the vast intelligence that operates the universe. This recognition, rather than being discouraging, is actually liberating because it frees us from the impossible task of trying to control everything through personal effort. When we humbly acknowledge our limitations, we become open to guidance and assistance from sources beyond our ego's comprehension. I discovered that these three treasures naturally support and enhance each other. Compassion without humility can become self-righteous and intrusive. Frugality without compassion can become miserly and selfish. Humility without frugality can become false modesty that still seeks recognition and status. But when all three are present together, they create a foundation for authentic power that no external circumstance can destroy. The modern leader who embodies these three treasures discovers that they provide everything necessary for both personal fulfillment and effective service to others. Compassion ensures that their actions serve the greater good rather than merely personal ambition. Frugality keeps them grounded in reality and prevents the corruption that often comes with success. Humility maintains their connection to wisdom and prevents the arrogance that destroys many promising leaders. These virtues also provide perfect protection against the illusions that create most human suffering. Compassion protects us from the isolation that comes from selfishness. Frugality protects us from the dissatisfaction that comes from endless wanting. Humility protects us from the anxiety that comes from trying to maintain false images of ourselves. In that jade pendant given to me by a woman who possessed nothing yet lacked for nothing, I found the complete teaching that would guide the rest of my life and become the heart of my legacy to future generations. Returning to the source is stillness, which is the way of nature. This teaching about the circular journey that brings us back to our beginning with new understanding became central to my philosophy. Through a profound personal experience that showed me how all seeking ultimately leads us home to what we already are. The mountain path that symbolized this principle for me was one I discovered during my years of wandering after leaving the imperial court. It was a winding trail that seemed to lead upward toward the peaks, promising elevated views and spiritual insight. I spent many months climbing this path, driven by the belief that wisdom lay somewhere ahead of me, at some higher altitude of understanding. But as I continued climbing, something unexpected happened. The path gradually curved back on itself, and after what felt like tremendous progress upward, I found myself returning to the very valley where I had begun my ascent. At first I felt frustrated and confused. Had I wasted all that effort only to end up where I started? But as I looked around, with eyes educated by the journey, I realized that while the location was the same, my perception had completely transformed. The simple valley that I had initially dismissed as ordinary now revealed itself as extraordinarily beautiful. The humble wildflowers I had barely noticed before seemed to glow with inner light. The quiet stream I had taken for granted now sounded like the most profound teaching I had ever heard. This experience taught me that spiritual development is not about going somewhere else or becoming someone different, but about seeing clearly what has always been present. The eternal that we seek in distant places and future accomplishments is actually available in every ordinary moment, waiting to be recognized by eyes that have been cleared of the film of seeking and striving. I began to understand that all the sophisticated philosophy and complex practices I had studied were ultimately designed to bring me back to the original simplicity that children possess naturally. Before we learn to think of ourselves as separate individuals who must achieve something to be worthy, we exist in a state of natural wholeness that needs nothing added to it. This return to the source is not regression, but integration. We don't abandon the wisdom gained through experience, but see it from the perspective of our original nature. Like the executive who rediscovers joy by simplifying their life, we learn to hold our accomplishments lightly while reconnecting with the simple presence that is our true foundation. The circular nature of this journey explains why so many seekers eventually find themselves drawn back to practices and understandings they had dismissed as too simple in their earlier, more ambitious phases of development. The breathing meditation that seemed boring when we were pursuing exotic techniques reveals profound depths when approached with mature appreciation. The basic ethical principles we thought we had outgrown proved to be the foundation for all genuine advancement. I observed this pattern repeatedly in my students. The most intellectually sophisticated among them often had to unlearn their complexity before they could access genuine understanding. Their minds were so full of concepts and theories that there was no space for direct perception to emerge. They had to return to not knowing before they could truly know. This return is not about rejecting learning or experience, but about finding their proper place in relation to our essential nature. Knowledge becomes a tool we use when helpful rather than an identity we must maintain. Achievements become expressions of our natural creativity rather than evidence of our worth. Relationships become opportunities for sharing love, rather than transactions for getting our needs met. The stillness that characterizes this return to source is not empty inactivity, but full presence, the same quality displayed by a cat resting in a sunbeam, completely alert, yet perfectly relaxed. This stillness contains infinite potential for response, while requiring no particular action in the present moment. I discovered that this teaching applies to every level of human experience. In daily life, we often solve problems by returning to basics rather than adding more complexity. The relationship that has become complicated through accumulated misunderstandings often heals when both people return to the simple love that brought them together. The business that has lost its way through excessive growth and diversification often regains vitality by returning to its core purpose and values. Even our approach to challenges benefits from this principle. Instead of immediately trying to fix problems through additional effort and strategy, we can often resolve them by returning to the calm center from which wise action naturally emerges. The solution we seek through complicated analysis frequently becomes obvious when we stop trying so hard and allow our natural intelligence to function freely. The mountain path taught me that there is nowhere to go and nothing to achieve because we already are what we're seeking to become. The journey is valuable not because it takes us somewhere else, but because it exhausts our illusions about being anywhere other than where we are. When we finally stop running toward or away from our experience, we discover the profound peace and aliveness that has been waiting patiently for our return. This is the ultimate freedom. Not the freedom to go anywhere we want, but the freedom to be fully present wherever we are, recognizing that the source of all happiness and wisdom has never been absent from our immediate experience. The sage is not ill because he sees himself as part of the universe. This understanding of death and immortality came to me through a profound meditation on the phoenix feather, the ancient symbol of rebirth and the eternal cycle of transformation. that governs all existence. What most people fear as ending, I learned to recognize as simply another movement in the endless dance of becoming. My deepest insight into the nature of death occurred during a period when I was caring for a dying friend, a fellow seeker who had shared many philosophical discussions with me over the years. As his physical strength ebbed, I expected to witness the tragedy of a life being cut short. Instead, I observed something that completely transformed my understanding of what we call mortality. Rather than clinging desperately to his fading vitality, my friend seemed to be relaxing into a larger rhythm, like a wave settling back into the ocean from which it had emerged. His individual concerns and fears gradually dissolved, replaced by a profound peace that seemed to connect him to something vast and eternal. In his final days, he radiated a quality of presence more luminous than he had ever displayed in perfect health. "I am not dying," he told me with startling clarity just days before his passing. "I am simply changing form, like water becoming vapor or ice returning to liquid. The essence of what I am cannot be destroyed, can only transform into new expressions of the same underlying reality." Watching this transformation, I realized that death is perhaps the ultimate teacher of the Tao's fundamental principle, that all apparent forms are temporary manifestations of an indestructible source. What we take to be our individual identity is like a wave on the ocean. It appears to have separate existence for a time, but it is never actually apart from the water that gives it form. This understanding freed me from the fear that drives most human behavior. When we believe that death is the absolute end of our existence, we naturally become desperate to squeeze as much pleasure and achievement as possible into our brief span of years. This desperation makes us grasping, competitive, and ultimately unhappy, because we're always racing against time. But when we recognize that our essential nature is the timeless awareness in which all experiences appear and disappear, death becomes simply another experience to be met with the same presence we bring to any other moment. The phoenix feather reminds us that what appears to be destruction is actually preparation for renewal at a deeper level. I began to see how acceptance of mortality paradoxically leads to more fearless living. When we're no longer anxiously trying to avoid death, we can fully engage with life. The person who has made peace with impermanence can take creative risks, speak uncomfortable truths, and love without reservation because they're not constantly calculating how to protect themselves from loss. This teaching proved especially valuable in helping others face their own mortality. I encountered many people who were paralyzed by death anxiety, spending their entire lives in elaborate attempts to deny or postpone the inevitable. Through gentle questioning and sharing my own understanding, I helped them discover that what they feared losing was often not their true self, but their identification with temporary roles and possessions. True immortality, I learned, is not about preserving the individual personality indefinitely, but about recognizing our fundamental identity with the consciousness that underlies all individual forms. When we align ourselves completely with the Tao, we participate in its eternal nature. Our actions become expressions of timeless principles, rather than desperate attempts at personal survival. I taught that there are two kinds of death: the death of the body, which is natural and unavoidable, and the death of the ego, which is voluntary and liberating. Most people resist both forms, not understanding that embracing the second makes the first irrelevant. When we stop identifying exclusively with our separate self, physical death becomes like taking off worn clothing rather than losing our essential being. The hospice worker who helps others face transition with peace exemplifies this teaching beautifully. Having made their own peace with mortality, they can offer presence and comfort to those who are struggling with death anxiety. They serve as living proof that it's possible to face the ultimate unknown with dignity and even joy. This understanding also transforms how we approach the smaller deaths that occur throughout life, the end of relationships, careers, life phases, and dreams. Instead of seeing these transitions as failures or tragedies, we can recognize them as natural rhythms of renewal. What appears to be dying is often making space for something new to be born. I discovered that meditation on death is actually meditation on life, because recognizing the preciousness and impermanence of our current form helps us appreciate each moment more fully. When we truly accept that our time here is limited, we stop wasting energy on trivial concerns and focus on what actually matters: love, truth, beauty, and service to the greater whole of which we are part. The Tao gives life to all things and death to all things. In this final teaching, I want to offer my guidance for how these ancient principles can transform your modern life, serving as a bridge between the timeless wisdom I discovered and the contemporary challenges you face every day. The way forward has never been more relevant than it is now. In your world of constant connectivity and endless demands for speed, my heart goes out to those of you living in this age of unprecedented complexity. You face pressures I could never have imagined: digital distractions that fragment your attention, social media that breeds comparison and envy, economic systems that demand constant growth and consumption, and a pace of change that leaves little time for reflection or rest. Yet these very challenges make the principles of Wu way more essential than ever. In your fast-paced digital world, the practice of effortless action becomes not a luxury but a necessity for survival. When you try to keep up with every email, notification, and demand for immediate response, you exhaust yourself fighting against a current that will only grow stronger. But when you learn to move like water, responding to what truly requires attention while flowing around the obstacles of endless urgency, you can maintain your center while accomplishing what actually matters. I encourage you to create daily practices that reconnect you with natural time rather than digital time. Spend moments each day observing something in nature. If it's just a single plant or the sky visible from your window, let these moments remind you of the deeper rhythms that govern all life, the cycles of expansion and contraction that your ancestors understood but that your modern world has forgotten. The principle of softness overcoming hardness is particularly relevant in your era of aggressive competition and harsh judgment. In your workplaces, the person who can remain flexible and responsive will outlast those who try to dominate through force. In your relationships, gentle persistence will accomplish what confrontation cannot. In your personal growth, self-compassion will create lasting change where self-criticism only breeds resistance. Practice the art of productive pausing throughout your day. Before responding to difficult emails, before making important decisions, before reacting to frustrating situations, take 3 conscious breaths and connect with the stillness that exists beneath surface turbulence. This simple practice can transform your effectiveness and preserve your peace of mind. The 3 treasures, compassion, frugality, and humility, offer particular guidance for navigating your consumer culture and social media landscape. Cultivate compassion for others who struggle with the same pressures you face, remembering that the anger and criticism you encounter online often stems from people's own pain and overwhelm. Practice frugality not as deprivation but as conscious choice, finding satisfaction in enough rather than always seeking more. Embrace humility by admitting when you don't know something rather than pretending to have opinions about everything. Learn to distinguish between problems that require action and problems that require patience. Your culture's bias toward immediate solutions often creates more complications than it resolves. Some challenges resolve themselves when given time and space, like muddy water that clears when allowed to settle. Others require gentle, consistent effort over long periods, like water wearing away stone. The wisdom of knowing when to stop is crucial in an age that celebrates endless hustle and productivity. Create boundaries around your work, your consumption of news and entertainment, and your engagement with digital devices. Recognize that sustainable success comes from rhythms of effort and rest, not from constant pushing toward arbitrary goals. Most importantly, remember that you don't need to perfect these teachings to benefit from them. The Tao works through your sincere effort, not your flawless execution. Begin where you are, with whatever capacity you have, and trust that small, consistent steps in alignment with these principles will gradually transform your entire approach to living. My final blessing for you is this: may you find the courage to move through your complex world with the simplicity of water, the patience of ancient trees, and the gentle strength that comes from aligning yourself with the intelligence that created you. May you discover that within the apparent chaos of modern life, the same eternal Tao that guided me continues to flow, offering peace to those who learn to recognize its presence and dance with its rhythm. The way is always available, in every moment, in every breath, in every choice to respond with wisdom rather than react with fear. Trust this ancient current that flows beneath all temporary circumstances, and let it carry you toward the authentic power and lasting peace that are your birthright as a conscious being in this magnificent, mysterious universe. The gentle path conquers all.